Hey guys, tonight we begin with a little trip back to ancient Rome. So get comfortable, dim your lights, maybe grab a blanket or tea, and let's drift slowly into a world where life was short, sandals were always dusty, and career choices included either farming or being fed to lions for other people's entertainment. Yes, tonight we're talking about gladiators. And before you start picturing Russell Crowe shouting, "Are you not entertained?" remember that Hollywood leaves out the small, unglamorous details. Things like fleas, moldy bread, or your trainer yelling at you for not dying dramatically enough. So let's just float into it, one scratchy leather sandal at a time. Gladiators were, of course, fighters, trained to put on bloody shows for Roman crowds. They weren't volunteers. Not usually. The majority were slaves, prisoners of war, or criminals. Imagine you stole some bread or mouthed off to the wrong governor, and now you're part of the entertainment industry. Not exactly a Hollywood dream. And let's pause on that word entertainment, because Romans really had an interesting definition of fun. Their version of a Netflix binge was watching sweaty men stab each other under the hot Italian sun while eating questionable sausages. It was less relaxing Friday night, more like collective therapy session with murder. Now, when someone became a gladiator, they usually ended up in what was called a ludus, basically a gladiator school. Though the word school makes it sound like you were learning algebra or philosophy. No, this was more like a gym where you couldn't leave and the personal trainers actually hit you with sticks. The schools were run by men called lanistae. These were like managers of human misery. The lanista bought slaves, trained them, and then rented them out to games. So if you're picturing a modern sports agent, just replace the fancy suit with a tunic, and instead of arguing over salaries, imagine haggling over whether someone gets fed to lions or just stabbed in the gut. And yes, gladiators were technically assets. They were investments, which meant lanistae actually didn't want them all to die instantly. That would be like a modern football coach saying, "Okay, all my players will break their legs today, and I'll just get new ones tomorrow." Not great for business. So most fights were not actually to the death. Still brutal, still bloody, but usually survivable. Now let's talk food, because gladiators had a very specific diet. Ancient writers tell us they were sometimes called hordearii, which means barley men. Yes, their nickname was literally guys who eat barley. They were bulked up not with steak or protein shakes, but with cheap carbs and beans. Imagine you're training 12 hours a day, swinging swords, dodging axes, and all you're eating is something between oatmeal and soup. And on top of that, they drank a lovely little concoction of vinegar water, supposedly for health. Romans believed vinegar made you strong. Personally, I think it just made your stomach miserable enough that being stabbed didn't sound so bad. Training was, of course, relentless. You had to practice with wooden swords before they let you touch the real ones. The wooden ones were actually heavier to build strength, which sounds clever until you realize you're just bashing away at a wooden post for hours while someone yells at you. Think gym class dodgeball, but instead of a whistle, the coach has a whip. And remember, the audience wanted variety. You couldn't just be a gladiator. You had to be a certain type. There were dozens of categories. You might be a retiarius, fighting with a net and trident, basically a fisherman on steroids, or a secutor with a giant shield and helmet shaped like a can of soup. Some had curved swords, some had spears, some even went into the arena with barely any armor because, hey, drama sells. So not only are you a slave fighting for survival, you're also stuck with whatever gimmick your trainer assigns you. Congratulations, you're a net guy. Don't like it? Too bad. Hope you're good at fishing for angry men. But let's float over to the actual arenas. The most famous, of course, is the Colosseum in Rome. And yes, it's big and impressive, but from the gladiator's perspective, it was probably terrifying. Imagine stepping into a massive, echoing stadium, sunlight blinding your eyes, 50,000 people screaming, some cheering, some betting, some just there to watch you suffer. It's less like playing at the Super Bowl, more like walking into a nightmare pep rally where half the crowd wants you to trip and die. And don't forget, the Romans loved special effects. Sometimes they flooded the arena for mock sea battles, or brought in exotic animals like lions, elephants, and crocodiles. If you think your job is stressful, just remember, someone in 2nd century Rome had to walk into work knowing they might face a rhino before lunch. Now, here's where things get a little strange. Gladiators, despite their terrible lives, were kind of celebrities. Romans loved them. Their images showed up in graffiti, in art, even on little souvenirs. They were basically the pop stars of the bloody sand world. Some wealthy Roman women even swooned over them, because apparently nothing says romance like that guy who just stabbed 3 Gauls and still has blood on his sandals. In fact, there are complaints from Roman moralists that upper-class ladies were sneaking around with gladiators. Because, of course, if you're rich and married to some boring senator, you'd rather flirt with the sweaty, scarred guy who might be dead next week. So, yes, being a gladiator made you popular. But keep in mind, you were still legally a slave, which means your fan base couldn't really save you if things went badly. Fame without freedom is kind of like being TikTok famous, but still grounded by your parents. Now, death, because we can't avoid it. Gladiators died, yes, but not as often as movies make it seem. Some historians think maybe 1 in 9 died in each fight, which is still, not great odds. But remember, you could fight dozens of times in your career. Each fight was like rolling dice against fate, and eventually, the dice win. Sometimes, if a gladiator lost, the crowd could call for mercy. They'd shout, wave, gesture, and the organizer of the games would decide. Thumbs up, thumbs down, although historians still argue what the gestures actually looked like. Either way, your life depended on whether the crowd thought you were entertaining enough to keep around. So imagine your boss asking the entire office if you should be fired, except fired means stabbed in the chest. There were also special shows. For example, Damnatio ad Bestias, or Condemnation to Beasts, which is exactly what it sounds like. Criminals, or unlucky gladiators, thrown to wild animals, lions, leopards, bears. Romans basically imported half a zoo just for this purpose. And no, there wasn't really an escape plan, unless you count run in circles until eaten. Let's not forget the psychological toll. Living as a gladiator meant constant stress. Any day could be your last. The schools were prisons, the arenas were meat grinders, and your legacy? A scratched piece of graffiti that says, "Spiculus fought well." That's it. No statues, no history books, no retirement villa. Just exhaustion, scars, and the hope that your trainer doesn't sell you to an even worse show. And yet, here's the irony. Some people actually volunteered to become gladiators. Not many, but a few. Usually men in debt, desperate for money or fame. Imagine being so broke that your solution is, you know what, let's get stabbed for cash. Ancient Rome was not a land of great career choices. So when you picture gladiators, don't just imagine the Hollywood version with perfect lighting and heroic speeches. Imagine hunger, cramped barracks, vinegar water, and being forced to wrestle in the dust while 50,000 strangers scream for blood. That was life as a Roman gladiator. Not glamorous, not glorious, just a nightmare that never seemed to end.
So you've somehow made it past the first stages of gladiator life. Congratulations, you're not dead yet. You've eaten your beans, you've done your push-ups, you've learned how to stab without tripping over your own sandals. But here's the thing, Now you actually have to step into the arena. And, surprise, it's not the glamorous movie version. The Colosseum wasn't just one big Hunger Games. It was more like a chaotic variety show. On the schedule, morning animal hunts, lunch break executions, and afternoon gladiator fights. Yes, lunch break executions. While you're munching on your bread and olives, you get to watch some poor criminal reenact a mythological story where he plays Icarus, except instead of wax wings, he's strapped to some rickety props and then pushed off something tall. Spoiler, he doesn't fly. Now, as a gladiator, you were basically the main event, but not in the way you think. You weren't always fighting to the death. That was expensive. Gladiators were investments, after all. Training a guy for months just to have him die in 10 minutes? Not the best business model. So a lot of fights ended when one gladiator was wounded and raised a finger for mercy. At that point, the crowd would decide whether he lived or died. Imagine trying to perform at work while several thousand people are voting on whether you should get fired permanently. The emperor, or editor, the guy running the games, usually made the final call. And sure, emperors loved a good show of mercy every now and then. It made them look generous. But if the audience was in a bloodthirsty mood, well, mercy wasn't trending that day. And here's the ironic twist. Even if you lived through a fight, your body was basically falling apart. Gladiators got slashed, stabbed, bruised, and battered constantly. They weren't superheroes. They were walking injury lists. Archaeologists have found gladiator skeletons riddled with healed bone fractures. Think of it like being a pro football player, except with less protective gear, more stab wounds, and no million-dollar contracts. Speaking of contracts, let's float back to the basics of gladiator ownership. If you were enslaved, you were property. That meant your owner could rent you out to a lanista, a trainer, who would put you through gladiator school. Some people, though, actually volunteered to be gladiators. Yep, they signed up. Usually these were free men who were broke, desperate, or just chasing the weird celebrity status that gladiators sometimes had. Because yes, gladiators could be celebrities. People collected little clay oil lamps with gladiator designs, kind of like ancient sports merch. They had fans, sometimes even groupies. Though, to be clear, those groupies were usually the kind of wealthy Romans who treated gladiators as novelty toys. It was less romantic love and more, look at my new dangerous pet boyfriend. But back to the school. Training wasn't all push-ups and wooden swords. Gladiators were divided into types, each with specific weapons and armor. You might be a secutor, chasing opponents around with a short sword and shield, or a retiarius, armed with a net and trident. Yes, someone's job was literally to fight like a fisherman. Another guy might be a murmillo, carrying a massive shield and wearing a helmet with a big fish crest. Imagine fighting for your life while looking like someone's seafood dinner. Not exactly dignified. And let's talk about that armor. Gladiators didn't go in fully protected. The whole point was to leave big chunks of the body exposed, so the audience could actually see the blood. Chest protection? Minimal. Legs? Pretty bare. A lot of gladiators just had a helmet, a shield, and maybe some armor shin guards. That's it. Basically, the Romans designed gladiator armor with the same philosophy as modern reality TV. Maximum drama, minimum safety. Now, remember that crowd. The Colosseum could hold up to 50,000 people. Imagine being shoved out into that giant stone stadium. Bright sunlight in your eyes, people screaming, betting, waving their arms. Some are eating snacks while watching you dodge spears. Others are chanting for you to die quickly. Not exactly the calmest work environment. And here's the kicker. Your opponent was just as desperate as you. He wanted to live too. So while the movies show gladiators as noble, honor-driven warriors, the reality was more like two exhausted, terrified men trying to avoid career-ending injuries. The fights could drag on awkwardly, with lots of circling, feint jabs, and defensive moves. Not the clean, choreographed duels Hollywood likes. Think more sweaty panic with occasional sword clanks. But here's where things get weirder. Not every gladiator fight was fair. Sometimes the matchups were deliberately lopsided just to entertain the crowd. A heavily armored Murmillo might be pitted against a nearly naked Rotirius with his net, or an animal might be tossed into the mix. Lions, tigers, bears, oh my indeed, Romans were obsessed with exotic animals, and the arena was the place to show them off. It wasn't great for the animals, of course, who were often starved and prodded until they lashed out. And if you were the lucky gladiator stuck in the ring with one of them, well, let's just say you were basically a warm-up snack. Oh, and I didn't mention the heat. The Colosseum had a retractable awning called the velarium, but it didn't cover everything. Gladiators often fought under the blazing Italian sun, sweating buckets in heavy helmets with tiny icelets. Hydration breaks? Not a thing. If you passed out from heat stroke, good luck convincing the crowd it wasn't cowardice. Now, in case you're thinking, okay, but at least they got good medical care, right? Sort of. Gladiator schools did employ doctors because keeping their fighters alive was financially smart. Some of these doctors were actually skilled at setting bones, stitching wounds, and even performing surgery. But remember, this is ancient Rome. Anesthesia was wine. Antibiotics didn't exist. If you got infected, you might just lose the whole limb or your life. And let's pause here for a fun, ironic detail. Romans loved writing about gladiators in a very moralizing way. Philosophers like Seneca would go on about how gladiators were examples of courage and endurance, how they taught lessons about facing death with dignity, when in reality, the gladiators themselves were probably like, I actually just want a day off and maybe some ointment for my stab wound. But sure, Seneca, call it noble suffering if it helps you sleep at night. The nobility of gladiators was a running theme. The Romans admired them, but also despised them. Gladiators were heroes of the arena, yet socially they were considered infames, dishonorable, on the same level as prostitutes and actors. You could be cheered in the Colosseum one day and refused service at a respectable dinner party the next. It's kind of like modern celebrity culture. Famous on Instagram, ignored at the bank. And then there was the possibility of freedom. If you survived long enough and fought well, you might be awarded a wooden sword, called the rudis. That meant retirement. You'd earned your way out of the blood business. But this was rare. Most gladiators didn't make it that far. Many died young, often before 30. Not exactly the kind of retirement plan you'd hope for. Still, a few gladiators became legends. Their names were remembered, their fights recorded on graffiti and in poems. People would ice little doodles of their favorite gladiators on walls, kind of like ancient fan art. They had fans, sometimes even groupies. Though, to be clear, those groupies were usually the kind of wealthy Romans who treated gladiators as novelty toys. It was less romantic love and more, look at my new dangerous pet boyfriend. But back to the school. Training wasn't all push-ups and wooden swords. Gladiators were divided into types, each with specific weapons and armor. You might be a secutor, chasing opponents around with a short sword and shield, or a Rotirius, armed with a net and trident. Yes, someone's job was literally to fight like a fisherman. Another guy might be a Murmillo, carrying a massive shield and wearing a helmet with a big fish crest. Imagine fighting for your life while looking like someone's seafood dinner. Not exactly dignified. And let's talk about that armor. Gladiators didn't go in fully protected. The whole point was to leave big chunks of the body exposed so the audience could actually see the blood. Chest protection? Minimal. Legs? Pretty bare. A lot of gladiators just had a helmet, a shield, and maybe some armor shin guards. That's it. Basically, the Romans designed gladiator armor with the same philosophy as modern reality TV. Maximum drama, minimum safety. Now, remember that crowd. The Colosseum could hold up to 50,000 people. Imagine being shoved out into that giant stone stadium, bright sunlight in your eyes, people screaming, betting, waving their arms. Some are eating snacks while watching you dodge spears. Others are chanting for you to die quickly. Not exactly the calmest work environment. And here's the kicker. Your opponent was just as desperate as you. He wanted to live too. So while the movies show gladiators as noble, honor-driven warriors, the reality was more like two exhausted, terrified men trying to avoid career-ending injuries. The fights could drag on awkwardly, with lots of circling, feint jabs, and defensive moves. Not the clean, choreographed duels Hollywood likes. Think more sweaty panic with occasional sword clanks. But here's where things get weirder. Not every gladiator fight was fair. Sometimes the matchups were deliberately lopsided just to entertain the crowd. A heavily armored Murmillo might be pitted against a nearly naked Rotirius with his net. Or an animal might be tossed into the mix. Lions, tigers, bears. Oh my indeed, Romans were obsessed with